Funny how you can pay for an entire wedding and still be introduced as if you never existed. I noticed the name tag before anyone noticed me. It was placed neatly on the round table near the entrance, printed in elegant gold script, the kind you'd expect for honored guests. But the words beneath my name weren't elegant. They were deliberate. The absent old lady. I stood there for a moment, holding my clutch a little tighter than usual, reading it again just to be sure I hadn't misunderstood. Around me, guests walked in, smiling, adjusting their suits and dresses, handing over gifts, laughing softly as a string quartet played somewhere beyond the archway. No one said anything. No one looked surprised. A few eyes flickered toward me, then away, as if they had already been told not to react. I picked up the tag. It was thick cardstock. Custom printed. This wasn't a mistake. This was planned. I let out a small breath, the kind you take when you decide not to make a scene. Then I pinned it to my dress. The same navy dress I had bought months ago after Emily called me, her voice bright and sweet, telling me she wanted her grandmother to look timeless on her special day. I had smiled then too. I walked into the venue slowly, taking in the details I had paid for. The chandeliers I had approved after 3 different samples. The floral arrangements flown in from Oregon because Emily said local roses didn't photograph well. The ivory table linens, the hand-lettered place cards, the open bar I had insisted on because I didn't want anyone to feel limited. I knew every inch of that room, not because I had been invited into the planning, but because every invoice had passed through my hands. $85,000. That was the final number. I remembered the last check I wrote, sitting at my kitchen table with a cup of tea gone cold beside me, telling myself it was worth it. That family was worth it. That Emily was worth it. As I moved further inside, I saw her. My granddaughter. Standing near the stage, radiant in white, laughing with a group of bridesmaids. She looked exactly how she had always dreamed. For a second, I allowed myself to feel proud. Then she glanced in my direction. Just a glance. Her smile didn't change, but something in her eyes did. Recognition, followed quickly by something else. Discomfort, maybe. Or guilt. She looked away before I could decide. I kept walking. My heels clicked softly against the polished floor, each step steady, measured. I didn't rush. I didn't hesitate. I had spent too many years learning how to carry myself in rooms where I wasn't fully welcome. Near the bar, I caught a fragment of conversation between 2 guests. I heard she didn't even want to be involved. Really? That's what Linda said. I didn't stop. I didn't turn. But I heard enough. Linda. Of course. My daughter-in-law had a way of shaping stories without ever raising her voice. She didn't need to. She preferred quiet adjustments. Small omissions. Gentle suggestions that settled into people's minds as truth. I reached my assigned table and placed my purse down. The name tag sat against my chest, light but impossible to ignore. Across the room, I spotted Linda. She stood beside the wedding planner, perfectly composed, her hand resting lightly on the woman's arm as she spoke. She didn't look at me right away. When she finally did, it was brief. A quick scan. My dress. The tag. My face. And then, a smile. Polite. Satisfied. I returned it. Not because I wanted to, but because I understood something in that moment. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a message. And I had received it loud and clear. I sat down and smoothed the front of my dress, as if adjusting the fabric could somehow make the words pinned to it less real. The chair was perfectly aligned with the table, just like everything else in the room, curated down to the smallest detail. I remembered approving that seating chart, line by line, trusting the planner when she said it had all been handled. I had not realized at the time that handled meant handled without me. A server approached and placed a glass of sparkling water in front of me. I thanked him with a small nod. He smiled politely, the way people do when they sense something is off but cannot name it. I kept my hands folded in my lap. Calm. Still. Watching. Across the room, the music shifted slightly as more guests filled their seats. Laughter grew louder, glasses clinked, cameras flashed. It was a beautiful wedding. Anyone could see that. That was the point. Everything looked perfect from the outside. I noticed how easily people accepted the version of the story they had been given. A few guests passed by my table, offering quick greetings. "It is so nice to finally meet you," one woman said, her tone careful, almost rehearsed. "We have heard so much." I held her gaze for a second longer than necessary. "I am sure you have," I replied. She smiled again, uncertain now, and moved on. The words lingered. "We have heard so much." Not from me. Never from me. I reached for my glass but did not drink. My reflection shimmered faintly in the surface of the water, distorted by the light. For a moment, I barely recognized the woman looking back. Not because she had changed, but because of how she had been rewritten in other people's minds. Absent. Difficult. Uninvolved. It was almost impressive how neatly it had been done. I glanced toward the stage again. Emily was being guided into position by the photographer, her veil adjusted, her smile practiced and perfect. Linda stood nearby, giving small instructions, her voice low but firm. She did not need to raise it. People listened to her anyway. They always had. I remembered the first time I noticed it, years ago, when she gently corrected something I had said at a family dinner. It had seemed harmless then. A small thing. But small things have a way of growing when no one challenges them. The music softened, signaling that the ceremony would begin soon. Guests began to settle. Chairs scraped lightly against the floor as everyone turned their attention forward. I remained still, my posture straight, my expression neutral. Inside, pieces were shifting. Quietly. Methodically. Like a puzzle finally starting to come together. The conversation I had overheard near the bar repeated in my mind. She did not want to be involved. That was the story. That was how they explained my absence while spending every dollar I had given. It was not just exclusion. It was replacement. They had not only removed me from the process. They had rewritten my role entirely. I looked down at the name tag again. The absent old lady. It was not meant to describe where I was. It was meant to define who I was. A label, simple and cruel, easy for others to accept without question. I let my fingers brush lightly against the edge of it, feeling the raised lettering beneath my fingertips. Carefully chosen words. Professionally printed. Nothing about this was impulsive. This had been decided long before I walked through those doors. I lifted my head and scanned the room once more, slower this time, noticing the connections, the glances, the subtle confirmations between people who believed they understood the situation. I saw how comfortably they sat in that belief. How complete the illusion was. And then, just as quietly as the realization settled in, something else followed. Not anger. Not even hurt. Something steadier than that. Clarity. I did not need to confront anyone. I did not need to explain myself. The truth did not require volume. It required timing. And as the officiant stepped into place and the room fell into a respectful silence, I understood something they did not. This story they had created about me was only convincing because I had allowed it to remain unchallenged. That was about to change. Not with words. Not with a scene. But in a way they would not be able to ignore. The officiant began to speak, his voice calm and measured, the kind of voice meant to guide people through moments they would remember for the rest of their lives. Everyone turned their attention forward. Everyone except me. I watched the room instead. I watched how easily people leaned into the story they had been given, how comfortably they sat in their version of events. It fascinated me, in a quiet way. Not because it surprised me, but because of how complete it was. The illusion had been built carefully, piece by piece, long before this day. I could see it now. The missed calls that were never returned. The planning meetings I was told had been cancelled. The decisions made without me, followed by polite updates that sounded more like conclusions than conversations. At the time, I had accepted it. I had told myself they were busy. That young people had their own way of doing things. That I should not interfere. I had mistaken exclusion for independence. That was my first mistake. I folded my hands together and rested them lightly on the table, my fingers still, my posture unchanged. The ceremony continued. Vows were exchanged. Promises were made. Words about love, trust, and family filled the air, drifting over a room that looked exactly like what it was supposed to be. Perfect. Seamless. Convincing. I listened, not to the words themselves, but to the space between them. That was where the truth always lived. In the pauses. In the things that were not said. I noticed how my name was never mentioned. Not once. Not in the acknowledgements, not in the quiet smiles passed between family members, not even in the subtle gestures that usually include someone without drawing attention. It was a complete erasure. Clean. Intentional. I glanced again toward Linda. She stood with her shoulders relaxed, her expression composed, as if everything was unfolding exactly as she had planned. There was no tension in her face, no sign of concern. Only control. She had always understood something most people did not. That power does not need to be loud. It only needs to be consistent. And she had been consistent for years. Slowly shaping how others saw me, one conversation at a time, one suggestion placed gently into the right ear. I could almost hear her voice in those earlier moments, explaining my absence with quiet certainty. She did not want to be involved. Such a simple sentence. So easy to believe. Especially when it is repeated enough times. I let out a slow breath, barely noticeable, and allowed myself to revisit the past with clearer eyes. The time I offered to help choose the venue and was told it had already been decided. The moment I asked about the guest list and was assured everything was under control. The way Emily's tone had shifted over the months, from warm and excited to polite and distant. I had noticed it, of course. I had felt it. But I had not questioned it. I had chosen peace over clarity. That was my second mistake. A soft round of applause broke my thoughts as the couple was pronounced married. The room filled with smiles and celebration, people rising from their seats, turning toward one another with joy that felt almost rehearsed. I remained seated for a moment longer, letting the noise pass over me. I looked down once more at the name tag pinned to my chest. The absent old lady. It had done its job. It had told everyone exactly how to see me. And for a while, I had allowed it to define the moment. But something had shifted now. Not outside. Inside. The story they had written no longer fit the reality I understood. And more importantly, I knew something they had overlooked. Something small. Something buried in the details they thought did not matter. I reached for my purse and rested my hand on it, feeling the familiar texture beneath my fingers. Calm. Steady. Certain. I did not need to interrupt the celebration. I did not need to correct anyone in front of this room. The truth does not require an audience to exist. It only requires the right moment to be seen. And as the guests began to move toward the reception area, laughter growing louder, music shifting into something more upbeat. I stood up slowly, smoothing my dress once more. I adjusted the name tag, not to remove it, but to straighten it. Let them see it clearly. Let them believe in it just a little longer. Because very soon, that belief would be the thing that unraveled everything they thought they had so carefully put together. The reception unfolded exactly the way it was designed to, smooth and effortless on the surface, every detail moving in quiet coordination as guests found their tables and servers carried trays of champagne through the room. I walked in with the rest of them, unhurried, blending into a celebration that had been carefully arranged without ever truly including me. The band began to play something light and familiar, the kind of music that encourages people to smile and forget whatever came before. I took my seat again, this time closer to the center of the room, where everything was visible. That was important. I wanted to see how far this would go. A server approached with a menu card and placed it gently in front of me. I recognized the paper stock immediately. I had approved it myself, after rejecting 2 earlier versions that felt too thin. I remembered that detail clearly. I remembered most of them. That was the thing about being the one who pays. You notice everything. The menu listed each course in elegant script, paired with wines I had personally selected during a tasting Emily never attended. I had gone alone that day, sitting across from a sommelier who spoke with quiet enthusiasm while I made choices I believed would make this night special for her. I folded the card and set it aside. Across the room, I saw Emily and her husband being introduced to the guests, moving from table to table, smiling, accepting congratulations, posing for photographs. When they reached my table, they slowed slightly. Emily looked at me, her expression careful, her smile still in place. "Grandma, I am glad you could make it," she said, her voice soft enough that only I could hear the difference. Not warm. Not cold. Just measured. I returned her smile. "It is a beautiful evening," I replied. I did not mention the name tag. I did not ask any questions. Her husband nodded politely, then guided her along to the next table. It was efficient. Controlled. As if there was a schedule even for interactions. I watched them move away, noting how easily she slipped back into that brighter version of herself for everyone else. It was not entirely her fault. People often grow into the stories they are told about others. Especially when those stories are repeated by someone they trust. I turned my attention to the head table. Linda stood there now, speaking with the event coordinator, her posture relaxed, her tone low but precise. I could see the clipboard in the coordinator's hand, pages clipped neatly together, timelines and confirmations listed in detail. I knew that clipboard. I had reviewed earlier drafts of it weeks ago, before I was quietly removed from the final conversations. At the time, I had not questioned why the updates stopped coming. I had assumed everything was simply moving forward. It had been. Just not with me. The first course was served. Plates were placed in front of each guest with careful precision, identical in presentation, each detail aligned with the vision I had funded. Around me, conversations grew louder, laughter more relaxed as wine was poured and glasses were raised. I listened without appearing to listen, catching fragments of praise for the event, admiration for the planning, compliments directed toward Linda. "She did an incredible job," someone said behind me. "Every detail is perfect." I let that settle for a moment. Perfect. That word again. It seemed to follow her everywhere. I reached for my glass and took a small sip, letting the familiar taste confirm what I already knew. Everything here had been chosen with care. My care. My decisions. My resources. And yet, somehow, my presence had been reduced to a label that suggested I had not been part of any of it. It was almost elegant in its contradiction. I set the glass down gently and rested my hands on the table. Across the room, I noticed a man speaking quietly with one of the catering staff, his expression concerned, his gestures small but urgent. The staff member nodded, then glanced toward the coordinator. A small ripple. Barely noticeable unless you were looking for it. I watched as the coordinator walked quickly to Linda, whispering something into her ear. Linda's expression did not change at first. Then, just slightly, her brow tightened. It was subtle. Most people would not have seen it. But I did. Because I had been waiting for it. I looked down at my purse again, feeling the steady reassurance of what I knew rested inside. Not money. Not anything so obvious. Just information. Details. The kind of things that do not matter until they matter all at once. I lifted my head and allowed my gaze to move calmly across the room, taking in the carefully constructed perfection one more time. It was all still standing. Still intact. But not for much longer. Not once the final pieces began to shift. I did not move when I saw the shift ripple further through the room. It started small, almost invisible, like a thread being pulled loose from a perfectly tailored suit. The catering staff began to move differently, not with the same fluid confidence as before, but with brief pauses, quiet glances toward one another, subtle hesitations that most guests would never notice. But I noticed. I had learned long ago that control does not disappear all at once. It loosens. Slowly. I reached for my glass again, not because I wanted another sip, but because I needed something steady in my hand. Across the room, Linda was no longer smiling as easily. She was still composed, still speaking in that low, controlled voice, but there was a tension now, something just beneath the surface. The coordinator stood beside her, flipping through pages on that clipboard, pointing to something specific. Linda leaned in closer, her expression tightening just enough to confirm what I already knew. The timeline was shifting. And not in her favor. I let my gaze drift away from them and back to the guests at my table. They were enjoying themselves, laughing, complimenting the food, unaware that the foundation beneath the evening had begun to crack. One of them raised a glass toward me. "You must be so proud," he said warmly. I held his gaze for a moment, then nodded. "It has been quite an experience," I replied. That was the truth. Just not the version he believed. The second course arrived, though a few minutes later than scheduled. Not enough for most people to question, but enough for someone like Linda to notice. I saw it in the way she checked the room, her eyes moving quickly, calculating. Timing was everything in events like this. A delay here could lead to adjustments there. A single misstep could unravel the illusion of perfection she had worked so carefully to build. I placed my napkin neatly on my lap and allowed myself a quiet moment of reflection. This had not happened by accident. Nothing about this evening had been accidental. Not the name tag. Not the narrative. Not the way I had been removed from every meaningful decision while still being expected to provide the means for all of it. And certainly not what was happening now. Weeks ago, when the final invoices were sent to me, I had noticed something. A detail buried in the language of the contracts. A clause. Small. Overlooked. It stated that final confirmation of full payment required direct authorization from the primary sponsor. Not the planner. Not the family representative. The sponsor. That was me. At the time, I had said nothing. I had simply signed what needed to be signed and left one piece unfinished. One signature withheld. Quietly. Intentionally. I had not known then exactly when it would matter. Only that it would. I adjusted the edge of my name tag again, smoothing it against the fabric of my dress, ensuring it remained visible. Let them see it. Let them remember how easily they accepted it. Because soon, they would have to reconcile that image with something very different. Across the room, I saw the catering manager approach Linda, his posture professional but firm. He spoke briefly, his expression polite but no longer accommodating. Linda responded, her voice still controlled, but her movements sharper now, less fluid. The coordinator stepped in, attempting to mediate, but it was clear something had shifted beyond her control. I watched as Linda's gaze swept the room again, this time with urgency. For a brief second, her eyes landed on me. And this time, she did not look away immediately. There was recognition there. Not of me as I had been presented to others, but of something else. Something she had not fully accounted for. I held her gaze. Calm. Steady. Unmoved. Then, slowly, I looked away first. Not in submission. In certainty. I reached into my purse and let my fingers rest against the folded document inside. I did not take it out. Not yet. There was no need to rush. The evening was still unfolding, and every passing moment was doing exactly what it needed to do. Around me, the music continued, the guests continued to laugh, the illusion continued to hold for those who were not looking closely. But beneath it all, the structure was changing. Quietly. Inevitably. And for the first time that evening, I allowed myself the smallest hint of something that had been absent until now. Not satisfaction. Not victory. Just a quiet acknowledgement. I was no longer the woman they had described. I was no longer absent. I was exactly where I needed to be. By the time the main course was supposed to be served, the rhythm of the evening had shifted in a way that could no longer be dismissed as minor delay. It was still subtle to most, just a longer pause between courses, a few more glances toward the staff, a slightly extended silence where music should have filled the space. But to someone like Linda, someone who had built this entire evening around precision, it was unmistakable. I watched her step away from the head table, her posture still upright, her expression still controlled, but her pace quicker now, more deliberate. She moved toward the catering manager again, her heels clicking sharper against the floor, each step carrying a question she could no longer ignore. I remained seated, my hands resting calmly in front of me, my attention steady but unhurried. There was no need to follow her with my eyes too obviously. I already knew what was happening. I had known the moment I chose not to sign that final authorization. The catering manager spoke quietly, but I could read enough from the exchange. Professional firmness. A boundary being enforced. Linda responded with the same composure she always used, but there was a difference now. Her gestures were tighter, her smile thinner, her patience measured against something slipping out of reach. The coordinator stepped in again, her voice soft but urgent, flipping through the clipboard as if the solution might still be written somewhere on those pages. It was not. That solution had always been in my hands. At the surrounding tables, conversations began to shift. Not stop. Not yet. But change. Guests checked their watches. Some leaned closer to one another, lowering their voices, asking quiet questions that carried just enough curiosity to start spreading. Is everything all right? I thought dinner was already planned. Maybe they are just running behind. Small things. Harmless on their own. But together, they formed something larger. Doubt. I reached for my glass again and took a slow sip, letting the moment settle around me. The wine was still perfectly chilled. The lighting still warm. The decorations still flawless. Nothing visible had broken. And yet, the experience was no longer seamless. That was all it took. Across the room, I saw Emily approach Linda, her expression no longer entirely relaxed. She spoke quickly, her hands moving slightly as she asked something that needed an immediate answer. Linda turned toward her, placing a reassuring hand on her arm, offering a response that looked calm from a distance. But I could see the edges of it. The strain beneath the surface. Emily nodded, though not fully convinced, and glanced out toward the guests before stepping back. The illusion was still being managed. But it was taking effort now. More than before. I lowered my gaze briefly, allowing myself a moment of stillness. This was not about creating a scene. It never had been. It was about balance. About allowing the truth to re-enter a space where it had been carefully removed. And truth, I had learned, does not need to be loud to be effective. It only needs to arrive at the right time. I reached into my purse again, this time letting my fingers close around the folded document. The paper was smooth, familiar, carrying the quiet weight of everything that had been overlooked. I did not take it out. Not yet. Timing mattered. Across the room, the catering manager stepped back slightly, his posture unchanged, his decision clearly communicated. Linda stood still for a moment after he finished speaking, her face composed but no longer relaxed. Then, slowly, she turned. And this time, she looked directly at me. Not a passing glance. Not a polite acknowledgement. A direct look. Focused. Searching. For the first time that evening, there was no pretense in it. She was not seeing the version of me she had described to others. She was seeing the one she had hoped would remain silent. I met her gaze without hesitation. Calm. Unmoved. Certain. I did not smile. I did not look away. I simply held the moment exactly as it was. Because now, finally, she understood something she had not accounted for. Control is only absolute when every variable is managed. And she had missed one. The room continued to hum with quiet conversation, the music attempting to fill the growing gaps, the staff moving with careful restraint as they awaited instruction that could not be given. And in the center of it all, the balance had shifted. Not dramatically. Not yet. But enough. Enough for the first crack to be seen by those willing to notice. Enough for the story to begin changing, whether anyone was ready for it or not. The music did not stop, but it changed. It became louder, almost as if someone had decided to fill the space before anyone could notice what was missing. A practical choice. A familiar one. When something begins to slip, you cover it with noise. I remained seated, my posture unchanged, my attention steady as the room adjusted around the problem no one wanted to name. The servers had stopped moving with trays. That was the first clear sign. They stood near the edges now, waiting. Not idle, but paused. Awaiting direction that was no longer being given with certainty. Conversations grew slightly uneven, laughter delayed by a second too long, eyes drifting toward the head table more often than before. I saw Emily again, this time no longer moving between guests. She stood beside Linda, her expression tightened, her smile gone for the moment. They spoke in low voices, closer now, less composed. Emily's hands moved again, small gestures, questions without answers. Linda responded, but the rhythm was off. The confidence she had carried earlier had thinned, replaced by calculation. I could almost hear the questions forming in her mind. What changed? When? Who? And then, inevitably, why? I adjusted the position of my glass, aligning it carefully with the edge of the table, a small act of order in a room beginning to lose its precision. Across from me, one of the guests leaned slightly closer. It feels like something is off, she said quietly, her voice wrapped in polite concern. I met her eyes for a brief moment, then gave a measured nod. Sometimes things take a little longer than expected, I replied. It was a simple answer. Neutral. It allowed her to return to her comfort without pressing further. That was the nature of most people. They do not seek the truth unless it is placed directly in front of them. And even then, only if it cannot be ignored. A man near the back stood up and walked toward the bar, only to pause when he realized no one was being served. He glanced around, uncertain, then returned to his seat. Small disruptions. Quiet, but accumulating. The kind that erode confidence one layer at a time. I watched as the coordinator approached the microphone stand near the stage, speaking briefly with the band. The music shifted again, slightly louder, slightly brighter, as if trying to reassert control over the mood. But music cannot replace structure. It can only delay the moment people begin to notice its absence. Linda stepped away from Emily and moved with purpose toward the coordinator, her expression now sharper, less concealed. She spoke quickly, her tone still low but no longer relaxed. The coordinator nodded repeatedly, flipping through the clipboard, searching for a solution that was not written there. Because it had never been there. It had always been somewhere else. I let my hand rest once more on my purse, feeling the outline of the folded document inside. I did not need to look at it. I knew exactly what it contained. The final authorization. The one signature that had not been given. The one detail that transformed a completed plan into a conditional arrangement. It was remarkable how something so small could hold so much weight. I lifted my gaze again and allowed it to settle on Linda as she turned back toward the room. This time, there was no attempt to mask the tension. Her eyes moved quickly, scanning faces, calculating reactions, measuring how much had already been noticed. And then, once again, they found me. Only this time, there was no question in her expression. Only realization. Clear. Undeniable. She knew. Not everything. Not yet. But enough. Enough to understand that the version of events she had constructed was no longer secure. I held her gaze for a moment longer than before, not as a challenge, but as acknowledgement. Then I looked away, slowly, deliberately, as if the outcome no longer required my attention. Around us, the room continued to shift. Conversations grew quieter. Movements more deliberate. The illusion of effortless celebration had been replaced by something more fragile, something that required constant adjustment to maintain. And even then, it was beginning to show. I reached for my napkin and placed it neatly beside my plate, then folded my hands once more in front of me. Calm. Patient. Certain. I did not need to stand. I did not need to speak. Everything that needed to happen was already in motion. The story they had told about me was still present, still pinned to my dress in elegant lettering for everyone to see. But it was no longer the only story in the room. And very soon, it would not be the one that mattered. By the time the third delay stretched beyond what could be explained away, the room had begun to settle into a different kind of silence, not the respectful quiet of a ceremony, but the uncertain pause of people waiting for something that should have already happened. The music continued, but fewer people were listening. Conversations had thinned, broken into smaller, quieter exchanges. Even the laughter, when it appeared, sounded shorter, less certain, as if it needed permission that never quite arrived. I remained exactly where I was, my posture unchanged, my hands resting calmly in front of me, observing the moment as it unfolded with a precision I no longer needed to control. Across the room, Linda moved again, but this time without the careful composure she had carried earlier. There was purpose in her steps, but also urgency now, a tightening in her movements that no longer belonged to someone fully in command. She approached the catering manager once more, this time with less distance between them, her words clearly more direct. I could not hear what was said, but I did not need to. I saw the manager respond with the same steady professionalism, his posture firm, his head shaking once in quiet confirmation of something that could not be changed. Without the proper authorization. That word had weight now. Authorization. It had always been there, printed clearly in the contract language no one had bothered to revisit. No one except me. A few tables away, someone stood and walked toward the coordinator, asking a question that carried just enough concern to spread further. Others began to notice. Glasses remained half full. Plates sat untouched, waiting for a course that had not arrived. The rhythm was gone now. Not completely broken, but undeniably off. I reached into my purse once more, this time allowing myself to unfold the document slowly beneath the table, keeping it discreet but ready. The paper was smooth, the signature line at the bottom still blank, the space waiting exactly as it had when I first chose not to complete it. At the time, it had felt like a small decision. A pause. A moment of hesitation I could not fully explain. Now, it felt like clarity. I lifted my eyes again and found Linda already looking at me. There was no confusion left in her expression now. Only recognition. She had connected the pieces. Not all of them, but enough to understand the direction this was moving. She excused herself from the coordinator and began walking toward me, each step measured but carrying a tension she could no longer hide. The room did not stop for her. It continued in its uneven rhythm, guests still seated, still waiting, still uncertain. But there was a subtle shift as she moved. People noticed. They always notice when control changes direction. She reached my table and stopped just short of sitting down. For a brief moment, she said nothing. She simply looked at me, her gaze steady, searching for confirmation of what she already suspected. I met her eyes without hesitation, my expression calm, my posture unchanged. I did not speak first. I did not need to. Finally, she leaned slightly closer, her voice low enough to remain between us. There seems to be a misunderstanding, she said carefully, choosing each word with precision. I allowed a small pause before responding, giving the moment the space it required. No, I said quietly. There is no misunderstanding. I reached down and placed the folded document gently on the table between us, not pushing it toward her, not drawing attention to it, simply letting it exist where it could be seen. Her eyes dropped to it immediately. She recognized it. Of course she did. She had reviewed every document in this process, or at least believed she had. Her hand hovered just above the paper, not touching it yet, as if confirming its reality before acknowledging what it meant. The final authorization, I continued, my voice even, steady. It requires my signature. I did not elaborate. I did not need to explain the implications. They were already unfolding around us. The delays. The halted service. The quiet confusion spreading through the room. It was all connected to that one missing piece. Linda straightened slightly, her composure returning in fragments, her mind already moving through possible solutions. But there were fewer options now than there had been before. Control, once disrupted, does not return as easily as it leaves. I watched as she finally placed her hand on the document, her fingers resting lightly against the edge, not yet claiming it, not yet deciding what to do next. Around us, the room continued to wait. And for the first time that evening, the silence did not belong to me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Linda's hand rested lightly on the document, her fingers no longer hesitant but not yet decisive, as if she understood that whatever she chose to do next would not simply fix a delay, but redefine the entire evening. Around us, the room continued to exist in that fragile pause, guests waiting politely, conversations thinning into quiet observations, the soft music now unable to disguise the absence of what should have already been underway. I remained seated, my posture composed, my gaze steady on her face, allowing her the space to arrive at the truth on her own terms. You could have mentioned this earlier, she said finally, her voice controlled, but carrying a tightness that had not been there before. I considered her words for a brief moment before answering, not out of uncertainty, but because the timing of a response matters more than the response itself. I was given a name before I was given a voice, I replied calmly. I thought it was appropriate to let that settle first. Her expression shifted, just slightly, as the meaning landed. Not dramatic, not exaggerated, but enough. Enough to show that she understood the connection between the small card pinned to my dress and the document. Now resting beneath her hand. For the first time that evening, the balance between us was no longer assumed. It was visible. Measured. And undeniably altered. She glanced briefly toward the head table where Emily still stood, her posture now less certain, her smile replaced by something closer to concern. The distance between them suddenly felt greater than the physical space that separated them. This is her wedding, Linda said, quieter now, as if the statement itself could restore order. Everything is already arranged. I gave a slight nod, acknowledging the effort that had gone into the day, the planning, the appearances, the expectations. Yes, I said. It is arranged. But not completed. I gently reached forward and turned the document slightly, aligning it more clearly between us, not pulling it away, not offering it yet, simply making its presence undeniable. Every vendor here agreed to proceed on one condition, I continued, my tone steady, free of urgency. Final authorization. My signature. I paused just long enough for her to understand the full scope of what that meant, then added, without it, they wait. Linda's fingers tightened slightly against the edge of the paper, her composure recalibrating, her thoughts moving quickly now through outcomes, implications, consequences. She was not a careless woman. She understood systems. And she understood what happens when one critical piece is withheld. This is not necessary, she said, though the certainty in her voice had diminished. I met her gaze again, not with resistance, but with clarity. Neither was the name tag, I replied. Silence settled between us once more, but this time it was different. Not uncertain. Not fragile. It was defined. Around us, the waiting had become more visible. Guests began to check their watches. A few stood, unsure whether to remain seated or move toward the bar again. The illusion had not shattered, but it had thinned to the point where everyone could see through it if they chose to look. Linda exhaled slowly, her shoulders lowering just a fraction, the weight of the situation no longer something she could manage with quiet adjustments or confident direction. She looked down at the document again, then back at me. What do you want? She asked, the question simple, but carrying more than it appeared. I did not answer immediately. Instead, I reached up and touched the edge of the name tag pinned neatly to my dress, my fingers brushing over the printed words as if confirming their presence once more. Then I lowered my hand and met her eyes. Nothing unreasonable, I said softly. Just accuracy. I let the word remain between us, clear and unambiguous. Not a demand. Not a negotiation. A correction. Linda followed my gaze briefly to the name tag, then back to my face, and in that moment, the path forward became visible to her. Not easy. Not comfortable. But clear. She lifted her hand from the document slowly, as if acknowledging that control no longer rested where she had assumed it did, then straightened her posture once more, gathering what remained of her composure. Give me a moment, she said, her voice measured again, though now shaped by something closer to respect than authority. I gave a small nod and leaned back slightly in my chair, my hands returning to their calm position in front of me. Take all the time you need, I replied. As she turned and walked back toward the head table, the room seemed to follow her with quiet attention, the shift no longer hidden, the balance no longer invisible. And for the first time since I had arrived, the story being told in that room was no longer about an absent old lady. It was about the woman everyone had overlooked, and the moment they realized she had never truly been absent at all.